Nonetheless, I was really impressed that the reaction within Indonesia, outside Indonesia, was strong, outspoken, and pretty much unanimous. Everybody said he clearly wasn't thinking right.
Yep.
So, but the good thing is, one Fadli Zon said is everybody got really angry and outspoken. So maybe he did us all a favor. Because the press was filled with stories. This is what happened. People appeared on TV. The younger generation was about to forget. Young people, gosh, 98, how long time ago is that? People under 27. Let's say people over 35 even do not remember this and might not know about this. For now they do. So that is actually very important.
Hi everyone, welcome back to ANUISA's Roundtable Talks, where we will dive into stories that often very important, that shape our society, but maybe got left out from common discussions. And we're your hosts, Kathleen and...
I am Nadir, as you remember it. So on today's episode is one that feels both urgent and deeply personal to most of us, in fact all of us. We're talking about the rewriting of Indonesian history itself. Specifically, the state's recent denial of the mass rapes that occurred during the May 1998 riots.
And these events marked a pivotal moment in Indonesia's democratic transition. Yet, over 2 decades later, the violence, especially the gendered and racialized trauma to the Indonesian Chinese society, often remain unacknowledged. So now, increasingly denied.
So in this episode, we'll be unpacking how collective trauma gets buried, how historical amnesia becomes institutionalized, and what role the media and public discourse play in shaping what we remember and what we're told to forget.
And we will be also asking what are the political risks of rewriting trauma and how do silence shape our democracy and what kind of public memory we owe to survivors. So, to help us explore this interesting topic, we're honored to be joined by Professor Hans Pols from the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. So we drove all the way from Canberra to Sydney.
Thank you for traveling all the way from Canberra.
Hi Hans, how are you doing?
I am doing
So
very well, thank you very much.
Yay!
Yes.
So, Professor Hans, can you tell us and our viewers a little bit more about your background, such as why are you interested in history within this context?
Indonesian context.
Yes.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. A while ago, I wrote a blog called Why I Am a Historian of Psychiatry. And the background is quite easy. I grew up next to a mental hospital in the Netherlands. And many people had that reaction, oh, mental hospital, crazy people, dangerous, violent. I had a very different experience. There was a big park around the mental hospital. Nobody went there because they were just a bit afraid. But as a young boy, I went with my friends and climbed trees, built huts, because nobody went there. And we bumped into patients. They were not dangerous, they were not scary, they were actually quite nice. Many of them, you could see the side effects of the medication they were taking, like weight gain, the tremors. But not scary, but I got quite interested in, what happened to these people? Why are they there? And that is my interest in mental health. What I didn't write in the blog is that my family from mother's side lived in the Dutch East Indies for several generations. The whole family came back in 1946 and nobody mentioned anything.
Right.
There were wayang, puppets on the wall.
Yeah.
We ate nasi goreng and beras ketan and all these beautiful Indonesian dishes, which is great because Dutch food, boiled potatoes, it's not really all that great. But what was there is the great silence. Nobody mentioned anything. And when we would ask questions to aunties, to family members, they would say, yeah, the war was not so great. But we got through it and it was beautiful. And then, of course, you should ask, what was beautiful? Tell me all about it. And then they really were kind of stumped.
Oh.
Of course, for me, the big silence was a challenge. I wanted to know, I wanted to find out. And of course, looking back, the Japanese occupation was terrible for Indonesians and for Dutch people. Dutch people think that they got it a lot worse. They were interned, there was little food, and I keep saying today, well, outside the camps there wasn't a lot of food either. Nonetheless, those war years, people didn't really want to remember very much. Dutch people went back to the Netherlands. Actually, for my mother, it was the first time she was in the Netherlands when she got there. Nobody really was interested. Yeah, there was a war going on in the Dutch East Indies. We had a war here. Yeah, we all had a tough war. Well, it's not well on. So this big silence over people are traumatized, don't want to talk. Especially when nobody shows any interest. I became curious. I started to dig. So an interest in Indonesia was there for a long time because I just wanted to know what happened there. What is it like? What was it to live there? So I went visit 20 years ago for the first time, and it was terrific. Mostly because Indonesians are so welcoming, so nice. I had an address of the house where my family used to live. My grandparents, my mother, her sisters, which was in Menteng in Jakarta, Jalan Sumeneb. And I was told it was number 6. So I go there, knock, knock, knock. It was a beautiful old house, and the woman said, oh gosh, come in, we just have like a family gathering, and there's lots of food. There were 2 old women there who had been teachers in the Dutch East Indies, so they spoke Dutch. One of them was dementing a little bit, and she was asking, oh, are you claiming the house?
Oh, yeah.
No worries. And so 3 hours later, I thought, look, I think maybe I should leave because I've been here 3 hours. And so I said, oh, sorry, I have to go. What, already? Leaving already? So yeah, these kind of experiences make me want to come back.
Yeah.
And well, the rest is history.
Yeah.
I did. Yes, met up with people with similar interest in history of medicine, history, trauma in Indonesia. And I have focused quite a bit of attention on these issues since.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you started out with the complete silence surrounding the issues with psychiatry, with psychology and mental health. And speaking about silence, the May 1998 riots in Indonesia were a historically significant period as it is the rise of gender equality and racial justice in Indonesia. So, why do you think sexual violence was so quickly silenced in mainstream discourse until now?
That is a really interesting question. I don't know if I can give a full answer.
Yeah.
But today in Indonesia, if you talk about 1965, up to 1 million people were killed, either communists or suspected communists. Nobody will dispute that. They might say, look, the communists were terrible and they deserved it. Or people might say, look, this was excessive. But the number, nobody's really going to dispute. About 1998, so many stores of Chinese Indonesians were looted, burned to the ground. Nobody is disputing that.
Yeah.
And then you get to the mass rapes, and then everybody suddenly gets upset like, oh, that didn't happen, or, well, maybe it happened, but it was not a mass rape, or it was just the crowds, or no, it was organized, there were some other groups behind it.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that caused, and is still causing, quite a bit of debate. For most Indonesians, the concept of rape did not exist. People had great trouble even imagining that such a thing was possible. We see the same thing if the child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church done by priests. For the longest time, people thought this is just simply not possible. Priests are morally exemplary people. They would never do a thing like that. It took enormous courage for victims to come out, go public and say, yes, this actually happened. And then at some point, public opinion shifted and yes, we acknowledge that, yeah, it happened, it's regrettable, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So May 98 for lots of Indonesians was the first time they were confronted with the fact sexual violence, rape, or abuse within the family, these things happen, and they happen more often than we should be happy with.
Ha-
That was a very hard lesson. Then there is the whole issue that if you acknowledge it happened, the second question is, well, who done it?
Oh.
And that is a question that people are not so eager to answer. Some people are not so eager to answer. Around 1965, there's still a big debate. The army was involved. That cannot be denied. Lots of Muslim groups were involved, Muslim militias, and they don't like too much digging because this is unwelcome stories. In 1998, army involvement or police involvement is suspected because it was all very well organized. It happened in Jakarta, in Medan, in Jogja, Solo, many places, and the scenario was very much the same. How come looting starts at like 5 malls in Jakarta at the same time? That's just strange. But yeah, there are people in power back then who clearly knew what was going on, who were responsible, or who were responsible for not acting. Armed forces were not present on the street during the riots. That's very strange because there were demonstrations daily at that time, and suddenly security was gone. Nobody really knows. As an aside, I'm thinking about the discussions about World War II in the Netherlands. When I grew up, the story was that, yes, the Germans were absolutely evil. They were all Nazis. But we Dutch were courageous, we shielded all the Jews, and we were all members of the resistance. Those are beautiful stories. But the more people started digging, it was clear that most Dutch people were not particularly courageous. Well, we can't blame them because this stuff is very scary. Recently has been a book published about Dutch government. The Dutch government itself went to London, they appointed 10 people to represent the government towards the Nazis. And these people were in very difficult positions because they had to work together with the Nazis, but they also had clear limits.
Yep.
How did they make the decisions? When did they make the decisions? For what reason? Because initially you try to appease the occupying force. You don't want to anger them unnecessarily. Where do you draw the line? These are really complex questions. And World War II, how long ago is it now? More than 80 years. Recently in the Netherlands, lots of books have come out about slavery. There were not that many slaves in the Netherlands, but the Dutch got rich from the slave trade to North and South America. Lots of the beautiful Dutch cities were built on that money. Nobody really wanted to talk about that. In the last couple of years, there's lots of research coming out about, well, yeah, this is how it happened. So the fact that in Indonesia was something that happened, well, not all that long ago, about 30 years, this is not at all surprising. It doesn't mean this is what happens with these kind of events more generally. Ideally, you just want to put it on the carpet and move on. There's yet another factor, and I'm glad you raised that already, silence.
Yeah.
Within Chinese Indonesian families, there's silence. These experiences were absolutely horrifying.
True.
They're difficult to talk about. So most people who either have experienced this, witnessed it, known about it, don't tell their kids. Which is not too surprising, because everybody's glad it's over. Then we get a problem of forgetting and collective forgetting. And that can be quite dangerous because, yeah, if you forget history, you're bound to repeat it. I am not 100% sure that we should get all the perpetrators to justice. It would be nice. Or at least those ultimately responsible.
Yeah.
What happens is that the little people who were involved, they are getting prosecuted maybe. But the people ultimately in charge, no, they're always going safe. Now that is unfortunate, but it still means that we need to keep remembering that.
Oh, okay. So I understand. I guess the first process in acknowledging these sexual assaults, these mass rapes that were committed in the past, the process from that point, eventually from acknowledgement to justice to reconciliation, I believe is very long. And related to this, you have actually published an article regarding the May 1998 riots, particularly how the term trauma has finally entered Indonesian professional and popular discourse in the newly published book Menyingkap Trauma Bangsa. Can you give us a glimpse of that article to our viewers of why discussions on trauma weren't initiated by psychologists but rather by activists and victims of the May riots themselves?
Thank you for asking that question. Of course, asking anyone to say, "Oh, can you elaborate on what you have written?" I always say yes. Actually, with Kathleen's help, I looked at publications in psychology journals. At that time, most psychology was organizational psychology, business psychology. Yeah, this doesn't really play a big role. There was a little bit about clinical psychology, and psychologists were familiar with PTSD, but they didn't encounter it an awful lot in practice. Also looked at the psychiatry journals, but there was only one, G1. Most of the articles there were about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, so the serious mental disorders that you would find in mental hospitals. PTSD is a different kind of thing. It is much more common. It happens to people who, well, they don't end up in mental hospitals. They could be severely damaged mentally, but unlike schizophrenia, they still live in the real world. So wasn't much attention professionally. But psychologists knew about it, at least theoretically. Now, under Suharto, when the Suharto regime was still there, it's kind of hard to say, oh yes, there's these people, they have been tortured or they have witnessed violence and therefore they suffer PTSD. That was something that it would be a little bit difficult to talk about or publish about. What happened now with the May riots, and I did lots of interviews of the people who were there, which was really inspiring because many of these people were incredibly courageous in providing help, providing assistance. And many of them tell the same story that they were either in front of the DPR building or in Bundaran Hotel in Indonesia. And it's like, have you heard about this? Wow, really? And this spread among, first of all, protesting students, women's activists who were very active at the time. You know, of course, the story of Carolina Zupelli, who organized a protest. She was brilliant. She said, we protest as mothers because the price of milk has gone up significantly. We can no longer afford the milk to feed our children. They had started a distribution center for milk for poor women a couple of months before to make food and milk available. She and the people that worked with her were arrested nonetheless. The trial happened after Suharto stepped down, and it didn't last very long because at that point there was no reason anymore to prosecute them. So what activists did, and we're talking about women activists, many of them who are psychologists or active in women's organizations, and human rights activists. First thing they did is we need to provide safe houses. We need a place for these women to go so that they are safe. There were lots of people who volunteered.
Yeah.
There's one famous story of the Haji who put his prayer mat around one of the victims, brought 4 of them home, and nobody, the army, wouldn't go there because, well, this is not a Chinese Indonesian home. They didn't expect anything. then was the issue of the world should know about this. So you get press releases, press conferences where people talk about that. Things got really, really difficult. Wiranto said a couple of weeks after, we went to all the hospitals in Jakarta. We didn't find a single rape victim. This is just a story. Around August 17, police chief said, this is people that are besmirching Indonesia. It's just scandal. It is imputing evil things that didn't happen. We will prosecute them. The police also said, oh, these victims, they should go to the police. We will prosecute the perpetrators. Most victims were not eager to go to the police at all for reasons we can understand. 2 weeks after the riots happened, in the press releases, people started to talk about trauma. There is a reason these women don't want to be interviewed for TV. There's a reason why they don't want to testify. They're traumatized. And for many of these women, it was absolutely terrible. Well, first of all, being raped is a terrible experience. We don't need to discuss that. Some women were kicked out by the family because you have brought shame to the family. If this becomes known, then I cannot marry off my daughters anymore. It is really awful that these views were still there, but this is not entirely uncommon. Other families were deeply embarrassed, but also they didn't want to have this known widely. Several families, well, the wealthier people, they hopped on the plane to Singapore almost immediately. Very nicely, some of them didn't have passports, and the people in Singapore said, just come on board, and we'll figure this out later. So these families disappeared. Many victims and their families moved elsewhere in Indonesia. They adopted new names. Some of them went to Australia. So they disappeared. And they were not eager for public attention. If something horrible happens to you, you don't want to have a journalist come to you and say, well, how did it feel? How did you experience that? No, of course not. So the concept of trauma was used to make it, to explain the reactions of the victims. Of course, they don't want to talk to police because the police, well, it's partly culpable. Shake hands with your rapist. Of course, you don't want to do that. They didn't want to be on TV. For the fact-finding commission, they developed a very interesting protocol called the Jakarta Protocol. There is testimonies were collected together with the results of medical investigations where the victim remained anonymous and the physician remained anonymous. Because treating physicians, they got threats as well. Once these victims were known, they got a lot of threats as well. So it became very hard to step forward. So if you want to make a part of history disappear, this is the way you go about it. And then, of course, the case of Ita Marta Dinata. And it's a little bit of debate in the literature whether she was a victim herself. I think she was, but it's not all that important. She was going to talk to the United Nations. And then the day before she was supposed to leave, she was murdered. The police immediately said, oh, there was a burglary. The neighbor was short of money. So he robbed the house. Strangely enough, nothing had disappeared from the house. Strangely, most burglars don't have weapons or big knives with them that would help you to almost sever the head completely. This is not a normal burglary thing. So whoever was not afraid yet to speak out clearly had second thoughts after this happened. And this is not even the whole story. Were two people who are outstanding, courageous in helping victims. Ita Fatia Nadir, who was with a group that already had organized women's shelters and support, and Romo Sandiawan, at that point a priest. He now lives in the Netherlands. I interviewed him. Well, I was interviewing him for an hour or so, but we spent 6 hours together. He said he walked into the house of Ita Martarinata. He was informed very quickly, but he didn't wear his priest outfit, just some what Zelensky would wear, a green military-like outfit. And the secret police was already there, around the body. And they were saying, okay, how can we make this go away? Okay, we'll talk to, the autopsy will be done. We'll talk to the doctor. And this doctor gave a press conference an hour after the body had been received. It's not enough to do an autopsy. And this doctor said, yeah, sodomy. This woman clearly, there is evidence of long-standing sodomy. And of course, all the journalists are, what, scandal, like to write about this. And it was like, look, whatever. This woman was murdered. Isn't that more important? Mm-hmm. But clearly, whatever techniques were available were used to throw doubts upon testimony or to try to bury it. So yeah, we're talking about really awful tactics. And the courage of everybody who provided support, directly, indirectly.
Yeah.
And that is also a really, really good story.
Oh.
Yes, I mean, this stuff is hard to discuss.
Yeah.
Yeah, we kind of have to do this.
Exactly.
And that is the problem. We have an obligation so that we don't forget.
Yep.
But the people, either victims who are closely involved, are deeply traumatized and they don't want to talk. You cannot force anyone to talk. That's not ethical. But these stories need to be told.
It's true. It is part of remembering history.
It is.
Yep. And Prof, we heard about trauma, but what is collective trauma? Is it different from the term trauma itself?
Yes and no.
Oh, okay.
Let's start again with the sexual abuse of kids in the Catholic Church. Initially, most victims thought it's just me.
Yeah.
And then you start to doubt yourself, right? Look, did I make this up? Is this real? Only when this became public and people realized this happened to a lot of children, then suddenly you can say, oh, well, this is a systematic thing. It's just something accidental that happened to an individual for unknown reasons. That allowed victims to band together and undertake action. First of all, to make it known. Some of them went for legal pursuit. So it is a collective trauma because it happened to so many women. It affected so many families. If someone is driven over by a car, well, or a tree falls down, that is just one individual occurrence that is really terrible, but it's just a one-off. This clearly is not. And it meant that, well, the whole reaction was kind of funny, right? Lots of Chinese Indonesian families left. We are not safe in this country.
Yeah.
A month later, Habibie and the government realized, oh gosh, our economy will suffer badly if all these families are going. So they said, oh, please come back.
Yeah.
So this is kind of funny, right? These Chinese Indonesians, already in colonial times, were subject to violence. But they were essential already for the colonial economy and then for the economy in independent Indonesia. So you have a group that's marginalized, sometimes target of aggression, very little political power, but economically essential. This is a very difficult position to be in. Now, the best way to convince Chinese Indonesian families to move back is to say, okay, we'll go after the perpetrators. We'll try to clean this up. Habibie promised this. President Habibie apologized publicly. And some gestures have been made in trying to hold people accountable who were responsible. But it's still officially shrouded in mystery what happened.
That's true.
And this, of course, generally in Indonesian history, if you do not like something as a politician, you don't order the military or official police officers to do it. you have all these gangs. This is not unique to Indonesia, though. This is how these things happen everywhere.
So, in this sense, can we only resolve collective trauma by resolving the systematic issues?
There are many ways. Some people say we need to get justice and need to pursue this through a legal system. That would be ideal. And like South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, that people could admit, yes, I tortured people, I did engage in all these misdeeds. They would not be punished. But at least it's acknowledged publicly what happened. And of course, that these people walk free is also a shortcoming of this process. Step number 1 is a public recognition. Stuff happened. This happened. And it should not have happened.
Yep.
That is step number 1. And we see a really interesting movement now in Indonesia that for survivors of 1965, 98, it's now recognized. And Jokowi, just before leaving office, expressed his regret, but he didn't apologize. Because if you apologize, that means that compensation could be paid out. But this is just what the Dutch government now has to Indonesia. The Prime Minister and I think the Dutch King also have expressed deep regret for all the wounds of colonialism.
Yeah.
But they haven't officially apologized because that could be very expensive.
Okay.
We might not be able to get the ideal solution of compensation. And compensation is like, what is a lot of money good for if you're this traumatized? I think the political recognition, ideally, when Habibi said, this happened and I apologize, that is a very important step.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even if there's no compensation. And actually for some victims, there's this human rights agency that gives access to health care, some forms of monetary support. Okay, well, that's at least something.
Okay, so the way I understand it is basically in a lot of these states, they use these trauma as in a way, not only as a tool, but oftentimes they outright refuse to fully acknowledge what has happened in order for them to avoid full responsibility on what has happened. And usually, I actually want to ask you, I want to go back a bit. How is this trauma usually processed or suppressed in post-authoritarian states precisely?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure if I can give a comprehensive answer. First, of course, ideally, there's a public acknowledgement. Now, after World War II, it is easy because the perpetrators were the Germans or the Japanese. They're now gone. Okay, so it's not so difficult to blame them. And as part of any peace settlement, there are agreements about what kind of compensation needs to be paid, etc. Post-authoritarian societies, this is a bit more difficult because the people in power back then, many of them are still around. So this complicates the issue of acknowledging fully what happened or pointing to the people that were responsible. Because, yes, people with power do not like to be exposed. So this means that one needs to carefully balance what can be done and what is possible. A free press is essential.
Yeah.
This came out through the press, right? They covered it. It appeared in the New York Times, very embarrassing for the Indonesian government, but yes, this was acknowledged. Putting limitations on the press is a great way of making sure this does not come out. We see this in the Gaza Strip right now. How many journalists have been killed? Because, of course, the Israeli army doesn't like things like this to come out.
Yeah.
And saying this in Australia today can be controversial because it could be interpreted as anti-Semitism. I'm only criticizing the way a specific war is fought in the Gaza Strip. But then again, if something is reported internationally, like 3 or 4 ambulances that took on fire, physicians were killed, they were buried. It came out in the press. And then, of course, the responses are, this was someone lower down who clearly didn't understand instructions. We will kick this person out of the army, or maybe put this person in jail. Won't happen for a long time, but the government got to be seen to be doing something.
Oh,
So, make someone down the food chain responsible. Go to a show and dance that we're doing something, this is unacceptable. And once a person has been in jail for a month, then they are released.
so blame it on someone rogue within the lower part of
Yes.
the chain of command.
Yes,
so
exactly.
As if to make it appear that this is not something systematic, this is something isolated.
Exactly. And then the people higher up are not implicated. And of course, people higher up never leave written instructions like do this or do that. That is hard for them. So, in an ideal world, all perpetrators would be held accountable. Everything would be public. This hardly ever happens. So we need to think about what is possible. I think a public acknowledgement, this stuff happened, is very important. That is a very important step.
I mean, reflecting to our current social political context, we're in the risk of forgetting history.
That is true.
That's true. So, what is the psychological or social political cause of denying collective trauma, Prof?
Well, first of all, affected individuals and families have nowhere to go. And nonetheless, the individuals, the families don't like to talk. Publicly, it's being denied. So everything can go on happily.
Yep.
Well, not really. Not happily. So everybody is becoming a participant to keep this whole stuff silent. But one role for history, I think, is coming to terms with the past. This is very difficult. I told you that historians are now publishing about slavery in the Netherlands, stuff that happened during World War II. And only now are not all people, but people in the Netherlands are thinking like we should think about this, we should discuss this. It can take a very long time. But coming to terms with the past, I think is necessary to be able to go forward.
Speaking of the cost of denying collective trauma, we actually have a recent incident nowadays. As you probably know, responding to Fadli Zon's statement on the 11th of June 2025, which is this year, the 1998 human rights violations, which unfortunately include the mass rapes, were merely rumors. Is this representing that selective trauma erasure?
I think it's merely an attempt at trauma erasure. Looking back, it is actually kind of humorous in the sense that it's a bad joke, a really bad joke. Reaction within Indonesia was quick, loud, outspoken, and explicit. Do a Google search, and you see hundreds of newspaper reports saying, what was he thinking? There have been so many meetings on Zoom that you could follow on YouTube, where Romo Sandiawan, Ita Fatia Nadia, and many of the other activists, they basically gave an overview. This is what happened. I have seen it. And they just remember, okay, President Habibie apologized. He apologized for something that didn't happen. That's silly. There was a fact-finding committee. That fact-finding committee was really a tense and difficult endeavor, because typical Indonesia, you need to get everybody around the table. Representative of police, representative of the army, of the government, of women's groups, and then you need to negotiate.
Musyawarah.
Yes, exactly. Is this really a case of rape? And here we get, sorry, this is graphic stuff, but we need to talk about it. According to Indonesian law, rape is defined when male genitals enter female genitals. Well, there were many cases in May 98 where this didn't happen, but a woman was penetrated with a big curtain rod, and enormous injuries occurred. But it is not rape. according
Oh
to
my
the
God.
Indonesian legal definition. So these are some of the difficulties. So the number of rape cases that the Joint Fact-Finding Committee reported on was relatively low. It's a tip of the iceberg. It doesn't matter. The most stringent procedures, I think there were about 150 you had, appear in that report that was conducted by a committee appointed by the government and accepted by the government. So at that point to say, oh, just rumors, this is really silly. And I think some people have been going over this, right? Fadli Zon has always been a protege of Prabowo. Prabowo says, let me put it very carefully, there have always been rumors around Prabowo about involvement in human rights violations in East Timor. It is possible he was involved in these riots in Jakarta. It could have been the Roundtable. It could have been both. That I'll leave to others to figure out. So Fadli Zon is doing the bidding for people in power, saying, "Oh, it's just rumors." And it is in this context of writing a national history in a positive tone.
Yeah.
So in all high schools, school kids read this and say, "Oh yes, I'm proud to be Indonesian." There's nothing wrong with that. But if you try to make people proud of being Indonesian by just, sweeping things under the carpet, I don't think that is the right way of doing things. Yes. Nonetheless, I was really impressed that the reaction within Indonesia, outside Indonesia, was strong, outspoken, and pretty much unanimous. Everybody said they clearly wasn't thinking right.
Yep.
So, but the good thing is, one Fadli Zon said is everybody got really angry and outspoken. So maybe he did us all a favor. Because the press was filled with stories. This is what happened. People appeared on TV. The younger generation was about to forget. Young people, gosh, 98, how long time ago is that? People under 27. Let's say people under 35 even do not remember this and might not know about this. Well, now they do. So that is actually very important.
I guess that's actually very enlightening to know that people actually reacted negatively to Fadli Zon's statement. Yes. Now that I guess we have a momentum of people telling their stories of what happened in '98.
Yes.
Now I wanna go from individuals and activists now, talk about the roles of the ethical responsibilities of public institutions such as you mentioned, school, media outlets, government bodies, in acknowledging this traumatic part of history. What are their roles? What do you think should their role be?
That's a very interesting question. First of all, in Indonesia, people often ask, what's the role of the government? There's so much more than government. There are always NGOs, civic societies, civic associations, authors, filmmakers, people in the media. I think it is interesting that so many novels have appeared about '98. And art, be it in writing, painting, is often a way of talking about what you cannot talk about, of expressing what cannot be expressed. So that adds to a legacy of recording what has happened. I'm not sure how much this has appeared in the movies. There's now a great movie out in Indonesia about the War of Independence, which I am very eager to see. I hear the Dutch soldiers are not Dutch, and that Dutch is terrible. But okay, we'll leave that aside. But what is the role of government? One thing that happened, there is a monument in Jakarta commemorating the victims. I think that is a really important step. One thing that helps healing is acknowledging this happened. Now we can have a story about how much should be taught about this in high schools.
Yeah.
This is difficult because you don't want to traumatize high school students unnecessarily, but there are ways of doing this. of talking about recent history that should be contemplated. Well, there's this national history. Is that a place to do this? I'm not sure why there is a national history in the first place. There was one under Suharto, together with that movie, what is it, the movie The Traitors of 65, which was a bit of a horror movie.
Yeah.
But it determined the consensus. Because everybody for 20, 30 years had to watch that movie every year. Like Indonesia just had 2 TV channels. So I think, of course, yes, the end of Suharto, the end of the Suharto regime has to be discussed in high schools. Under the Suharto regime, Indonesia got wealthy, much wealthier. The standards of living rose dramatically. So just to say that Suharto was a criminal, yes, he was that too. And he embezzled billions of dollars and they're still gone. All true. But we don't have to come up with a blanket condemnation of the past. We can be nuanced about this. But we cannot be nuanced about, gosh, what is it? What is these cases that people were murdered and the bodies were left on the street? Just to make sure, like, hey, I'm the boss here. So yeah, these things have to be discussed.
Ooh.
Now, how much of this can be discussed, let's say, in the first year of high school, I don't know. In the later years of high school, yes, you can start a discussion about this.
I definitely learned about the history of like 1998. My first year of high school.
You did?
Yeah, and
What did you learn?
like everything what happened, like who partake to the riots and everything. But most of all, like the students who got injured and, put their effort into the riots and everything. But now reflecting back to it, it raises kind of like questions like, how do I actually approach history and what is the meaning of history for us? And it kind of like a revelation for me that history is supposed to be a trigger to our curiosity and actually apply our critical thinking to it. What about you?
I mean, the point of learning history is from the one that I learned from middle school is so we do not repeat the same mistakes that we have done so in the past.
Yeah.
But eventually people find a way to revise history as this historical revisionism. That's not actually what happened, so we'll just try it in another way because that's not really what happened, That's also, but then again, I think it's also a big question on, well, first we have to understand, we have to have a call on why are we teaching this part of history? What is the purpose? What is the goal? How do we approach it? When should we start teaching our youngsters this part of history? Again, that's not a question I'm qualified to answer personally.
It's a very good question, and people who write textbooks or think about how high schools are organized, they do think about this. I think it's very important that the basic facts of history are discussed.
Yep.
So the fact yes, something happened in Indonesia at that time. In the first years of high school, the basic outlines of history should be taught.
Yeah.
I think when students are just 12 years old, it's probably not so wise to extensively elaborate on all the horrors. But people should know these events punctuate our history.
Yep.
And of course, Suharto resigning is a very important milestone in Indonesian history. And maybe in later years, it would be good to elaborate a bit more about what actually happened.
Yeah.
Other than that, what informs consciousness of young people? Well, TikTok, of course. But I do not know how you can put this in a TikTok, right? But nonetheless, people on Instagram, I'm not so familiar with TikTok, but there are attempts to at least highlight what happened. Movies are always very influential in how we see the past. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing. When I grew up, there were all these movies about World War II, where all the Dutch were heroes and all the Germans were villains. They were really exciting. It's about courage and do you stand up? Do you resist? That's all really interesting. I don't know, have any movies been made about 98?
Probably, yeah. Personally, I can't.
I think I recall something of watching it at school.
Yeah,
But I don't really remember what's the name.
it doesn't have to be all about 98,
Yeah.
but a movie where these events are highlighted
Yeah.
at some point, or maybe short movie fragments. These can have a tremendous conscious effect. The novels are already mentioned. There are so many of them. I'm not sure. Somebody thought a while ago Indonesians don't like to read. Well, that's not correct, because Indonesians do read an awful lot.
Yeah.
So these novels are, I think, quite a good way of highlighting what happened.
So it's the way
Yes.
we retell history. It's very important, especially when we're, targeting youngsters as our, target
Yes.
audience. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, as personal note, what do you think what should Indonesian scholars and students, or even us international students, can do in moments of historical erasure?
Speak up. Speak out. Interestingly, that Fadli Zon was attempt at historical erasure that completely backfired,
So,
because many, many people have found out it was not difficult to find out what happened in 98. If you just read magazines like Tempo magazine,
Yep.
2 issues this was highlighted, or the Compass magazine, the Compass newspapers, Jakarta Post, all of them covered this to a certain extent. So you had to be an ostrich, putting your head in the sand for a long time, not to have noticed. So speaking out in protest is very important, but also what is important that people start to tell the stories and keep telling them. This happened in my family, for example, or maybe not directly in families, might be a bit easier to tell stories that you've heard, to retell them. Almost immediately, stories appeared. There's a famous story that came out already in 98. I think it is called On the Way to the Airport. Taxi bus stopped, etc., etc. These stories are really very strong. Now, any politician might say, well, that's not evidence. Okay, there's enough evidence to speak of, but these stories make a very deep impression. Now, I had an interesting experience when I was in Indonesia a while ago, and I visited a hospital, and they showed me around an older hospital, quite interesting. And my host and I were chatting. Then I stepped into a taxi, and then this woman, who's about 45, I think, right now, said, "Oh yeah, 98 was a really awful experience for our family." That was interesting that she mentioned this to me the moment I stepped into the taxi. So I couldn't ask, can you tell me more? But I will revisit this at some point and talk with her about this.
Okay.
What do you think, Nadir? What do you think we should do as
Yes,
international
that's a very good
students?
question. Why?
Especially with your background, you're in astrophysics, you're studying outer space. Like stepping into this topic, what do you think your approach should?
It's pretty far-fetched to relate my degree with this topic, but either way, I agree with what Professor Hunt actually mentioned. Speak up. That's what any of us, regardless what do we study, regardless of what we're studying, that's what any of us could do, students or not. Whether you're studying economics,
especially when you have these student groups that you're all part of. That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess again, Professor Hans, thank you so much. That was an incredibly important and sobering conversation. We want to thank you, Professor Hans Pols, for helping us think through the intersections of trauma, history, and public silence.
Yes, and if there's one thing we hope that you can take from this episode is that remembering is not just about the past, but it's also a political act in the present, and it's also our act in the present. So when the government or any kind of like institutional body deny or erase collective trauma, it's not just the survivors who are harmed, but it's all of us.
And
that's a great conclusion for putting it that way. Yes.
Yeah. We have a responsibility to challenge institutional silence, to hold space for stories that were never allowed to be told, and to resist the kind of forgetting that protects power, not people.
Yes. So thank you so much for tuning in to ANUISA Roundtable Talks. This is our second episode with Professor Hans. And if this conversation moved you, please give us a like and comment and even share to your close ones. Because again, remembering history is about retelling them.
We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening.
Bye.